Welcome back. We had no internet this morning for hours, so it felt kind of like that light's a little weird, but it felt like we were in the Middle Ages or something where I couldn't even analyze my games, but no internet. So reminded me of the stories my grandparents used to tell about when they didn't have running water and had to go out to the outhouse. And so maybe this will be a story I tell my grandchildren. one day one day back in the past, the internet could just disappear for a few hours. So but we're back, thank goodness. Here, ooh, if I move this knight, I have a discovered check. Where should I move the knight? I wonder if I shouldn't move it here, which would make it double check. If I move the knight to e7, the knight and the bishop are checking. um, Same thing with f6. If I move the knight to f6 or to e7, it's a double check. One of those might be better. Yes, my queen's under threat, but this is just really tempting to move this knight out of the way of the bishop. And there might be something else, and I'm gonna look. I can't just take the pawn because it's guarded by both the rook and the knight. I don't think a queen sacrifice is the answer here, because then after the king takes, I won't have a follow-up check, or not a very good one. So that's why I'm kind of focusing on this discovered check and double check. It might not be a double check. It might be something like moving the knight back here, but I don't see what it could do from there. Okay, what's going to happen if I move my knight to e7? The only legal move would be for the king to move over. And then and then I could take this, but the king could just take it back. And I don't have any more checks. If I move the knight to f6, I think the same thing happens. Again, they can't capture the piece because both pieces would be checking, the bishop and the knight. But again, I think the only legal move would be for the king to move to h8. And if my knight's here and my bishop's there, what do I have? I don't have a follow-up check, other than the queen to g7, which the king would just recapture. However, if it did recapture and my knight were on f7, I would have another follow-up check coming back to h5. And the king couldn't get any closer because my dark squared bishop is guarding these two squares. Well, now it could come to g6. And then what do I do? Okay. That just... There I would have the follow-up check to g6. If I first went to e7 with the knight, the king has to go to h8. I would have the follow-up check of g6, in which case I think the only legal move would be for the pawn to capture on g6. And no, not there, because the queen guards that spot. And then would that be mate? It might be, because this pawn would be here. And the bishop would be guarding that spot, and the king would be over there. So if I move back here, the queen would have to block for a second, and I would take it. But I think that would be mate, because the king couldn't move back. Okay, well, that's what I'm going to do. Okay, I always make that face because I think I'm going to get it wrong. I've gotten so many of these wrong. Now, my plan is here, because the king can't move out of check. The pawn would have to take the knight on g6. And then I wouldn't go there because the pawn would take me. I wouldn't go there because the queen would take me. But going here, The only legal move would be for the queen to block, and I would take it, I think. I mean, I could just take the free pawn. But I think I'm going to go here. All right, I got one. And it only took 5 minutes. Good for me. The light's weird to you too, right? It looks like it's more yellow or orange than normal. All right. Let's click next. I broke 2050 on these puzzles because is it because I'm being more careful? Is it because I've learned more things to pay attention to, maybe? What do we have? If I don't check on every move, I lose. Because the queen and the bishop are both pointing here at c7. So, any move I make that's not check, white will win immediately. Unless I'm obviously able to take off one of those two pieces in the meantime. I do have checks. 1, 2, 3. I see 4 checks. But this is, I think, the worst one. Because it just gives up my rook to either one of those pieces. Probably the rook, I'm guessing. But just in case, let me follow it out. I would have a follow-up check, but then the king could escape behind the rook. I could win that rook, but that's not check, and then mate. Okay, so yeah, I think that's the worst of my 4 checks. There's this one and this one, but I don't think either of those are great. This one, obviously, I mean, the king could just move out of check, or the rook could capture it. If I captured here with check, and the rook took, I could check, and the king could come here, and then when I followed up, it would just take my knight. Sorry, no, the rook took here. Yeah, if the rook captured and I followed up and the king moved out of the way and I checked again, then, well, the king wouldn't have moved out of the way there. It would have moved out of the way here. So when I followed up, oh no, it couldn't go behind the knight. Interesting. My pawn guards those 2 squares. Check. Capture. Check. But the king could go here. So when I followed up, it could go here. And then I could check again. That might be mate. I was discounting that, but that might be mate. This one, I think even if the rook didn't capture, because if it did, I would capture back. No, if I captured back, I lose. Here, the rook could capture. And then I check. And the king has to move forward to one of these 3 squares. And I follow up. And if the king had moved there, it would be mate, because it can't move forward due to my pawn. But if the king had moved here, it could move forward. And I would follow up with the bishop. And I think that would be mate. So I'm seeing paths to mate with both of those, which I had initially discounted. What I first thought was this. Check with the rook on g1. The king can only come forward or here, and then follow with rook to g2. So I'd have a rook on g1 and g2. And that would leave only one move. whichever one of those squares the king had gone to, the only move after that would be here. Because again, my pawn guards this square. So the king would go there. And then I would pull my bishop back this way. And that would be mate, right? Because this pawn guards this square. And the bishop. I'm seeing paths to mate with all three of those. But I think the rook one was faster. Okay. Sorry, this one's taking a little longer, but I'm probably missing something. But let's just say rook to g1. Like, the king can't, because my rook then cuts off all of these squares. Their own rook cuts off that square. And, of course, my bishop would be cutting off f1 as well, leaving the king only 2 legal moves. And then follow with rook to g2, rook 8 to g2. So the first rook is still cutting off the first rank. My second rook would be cutting off the second rank, and my pawn's cutting off e3, which would leave the king only 1 legal move, f3. And bishop to g4 would be mate, because my pawn cuts off this square and guards that one, and the rook would be guarding this square. So that's mate in 1, 2, 3. Pretty sure. This check, capture, we still end up using the rook, and there's more choices for the king at that point. Still end up using, that's mate in 4, because we still have to depend on both rooks and the bishop. So the rooks are faster. I think the same thing was true if I tried this check. With the knight, we still end up having to use both rooks and the bishop. So those are mates in 4, whereas moving the rook is mate in 3, I think. And this check just is no good, I think. Yeah, I think that one's no good. Okay, I'm going to go rook to g1. Okay. And again, my pawn cuts off that square, so when I put my other rook down here on g2, it's only going to leave 1 legal move, and the bishop's going to be mate, I think. Wait, what happens if I move the bishop now? If I move the bishop now, it goes, the king can move over, and my rooks aren't protecting each other anymore, and I don't have a follow-up check. Okay. Okay. And this has to be made. Okay. I thought maybe a little too hard on that. And the theme is mate in 3, so that was correct. That puzzle was rated 1800. Just out of curiosity, I'm going to click on the Analyze page. And it says, well, they moved king to e1, which was a mistake. The king should have gone here at this point. But the king went there, which... Okay, and I did the right thing, the only way to mate. But why isn't the knight mate? That's what I'm curious, because I thought that was. Check. Okay, so it says that gives white the advantage. That's because the king can come around this way, right? And I don't have a follow-up? Is that what it is? Now, okay, now if the rook takes, it is going to be mate in 3 more. So total of mate in 4 counting this move. But if the king moves, then it's not. And at that point, I would just have to take the bishop to keep this mate from happening. But then they take my rook, and I take back, and it's okay. That's why the knight thing didn't work. I just wanted to check, and the other knight move didn't work at all for the same reason. The rook doesn't have to take. And now I don't have anything to take the bishop. Okay. Thank you for being patient with that. I just wanted to make sure that what I calculated was that both of those could be made in 4, but this was just faster, which is why I went with the rook plan. But the other two weren't made at all. Okay. Next. Let's see if I can break 2060. Okay. On this one, I don't have any checks to start. None of my pieces can get to where they can check the king because that pawn's in the way. I can't get all the way down with the rook because the bishop's in the way, and that wouldn't be check anyway because the other rook's in the way. So it's not check. We've got that. Maybe it's a capture. I do have a capture here, protected by the other rook. Or rook first, perhaps, so if they recaptured back, then I would fork these two pieces. I like that idea. The knight there forks the remaining rook and queen. So the queen would have to go somewhere, maybe taking a pawn, and then I would win the other rook. So I would have a bishop, a rook, and a rook for a rook. Maybe the queen would go here, so it would also pick up my knight. I don't know. Okay, so that looks good. Doing this now, doing it with the knight first, is a fork of those two pieces. But the rook could capture, and I would capture back. So I would get a bishop and a rook for a knight. Eight for 3. Okay, but the first way I said, I get 3. Wait, I would get a bishop and a rook for a rook. So that would be 13 for 5. That seems better. Okay, so that's not only a capture, but also the threat of the fork. So I did. There's no checks. I do have captures. Either way, looks okay. Looks pretty good for me. Do I have any threats? Say a checkmate threat. Right now, what piece? The other reason not to move my knight first is that with my queen. Oh no, my queen, as the saying goes. That would be a reason not to capture with my knight first because. Oh, but I would be hitting the queen right then. So if they took my queen, I could take their queen. But then they would take the other rook and have 2 rooks on my 8th rank. Okay, so that's not good. But if I did this, and they captured back, and I did my plan of taking with the knight, they could take out my queen. Before I took out theirs. Okay, that's interesting. I needed to see that pin. But I don't think I can threaten mate either. I mean, that's not threatening mate. Because, I mean, not only can they capture this piece, but even if they didn't, and I checked here, they just move out of check. I think. So I don't think that's it. I'm going to go with my original plan of the rook because I've taken several minutes on this puzzle, and if it's wrong, we'll go to the analysis board and figure out why. And I'm pretty sure it has to be this fork because I get the rook and the queen. But once I take the rook, they can take my queen. And then when I take the queen, they can take my rook, but then I would get the rook back. But I'm left with 2 minor pieces to their 1. I think. And I still can't check. So I think it has to be that. And now it has to be this, right? Or is it just this or this? No. It has to be the queen because I get the queen, and then this would be an even trade. Okay. Oh, wow. Man, who knew there was so much math in chess? Well, it says 6 in a row, but some of that's left over from my previous session. So I got 3 in a row in this video. Thank you for watching, and hopefully the internet will last long enough for me to upload this video. Thank you so much.